The finish line is in sight for our special series on the Indycar Split. By the end of this episode, we will have reunited the IRL and Champ Car, but we've got some bumpy terrain to get over before we reach that point. And as you'll expect by now, plenty of controversy. John Oreovicz and Ed Straw are back with me, Glenn Freeman, for the grand finale, where we can decide if this story actually reached a happy ending or not. And once we've done that, we're going to put out a post on the Race Members Club for you to ask us questions about the split. And John will rejoin us for a special members-only Q&A so we can talk about this endlessly fascinating story some more. We ended our second episode, though, with Penske's defection from kart to run full-time in the IRL. And unsurprisingly, they hit the ground running pretty quickly. Helio Castroneves and Gilles de Ferran claimed a 1-2 finish in just the second race of the season. But by the time the 2002 Indy 500 came around, they were actually second and third in the point standings, chasing the IRL's reigning champion, Sam Hornish Jr., who won 2 of the opening 4 races. At Indy, Penske were joined by some of their old foes again from kart. We had Ganassi bringing its full-time kart drivers, Kenny Brack and Bruno Junqueira, over. Team Green this time returned with 3 cars rather than the one it ran the year before. So we had Michael Andretti plus Dario Franchitti and Paul Tracy. Jimmy Vasser returned with Team Rahal. And Mo Nunn added a second car for his kart regular, Tony Kanaan. Ed, how excited were you by this prospect of the growing presence of kart teams at the Indy 500?
Yeah, it's great. It's what you want, isn't it? The Indy 500 is the biggest race in town. And you want the big teams, the leading kart teams, ideally all the kart teams, there competing in it with the big name drivers. So it's very, very positive. And it did hold that kind of hope that the reunification may be near, which wasn't quite the reality at this stage, although it was kind of, I guess, inching closer. But it was totemic, wasn't it? Because you want those teams in the Indy 500. You're not so worried about the other IRL races, but the Indy 500 was always diminished by the absence of the big kart teams, and you need them there for it to be kind of a full-blown 500 ultimately.
John, to bring you in here, by this point, as I say, we can feel that more kart teams are coming back to Indy every year. Was it starting to feel inevitable that therefore more teams would follow Penske and make the switch in series full-time as well?
I think that you have to look at the economics of things by 2002, which, water had reached its level in the sense that the IRL was down to 18 or 20 cars, Champ Car was down to 18 or 20 cars. The little guys were being forced out of both series now. I mean, the IRL in theory was created for the little guys, but the littlest of the little guys were out again. I think there was a sense of necessity that was starting to set in, or inevitability, that something had to give at some point. And when you had a major domino like Team Penske making the switch, it did, as we saw over the next couple of years, it did have a domino effect. And it was certainly good for the Indianapolis 500 to have the quality of its field. You could see the quality of the field steadily rising starting in 2000 when Ganassi came back. And so the 500 was starting to feel its oats again after, arguably struggling a little bit. Attendance definitely dropped in the late 90s. But there was definitely a sense that the Indy 500, if not IndyCar racing, as it was not allowed to be called still in 2002, was starting on the comeback trail.
The finish of this race would be one of the most controversial in Indy 500 history. And naturally, that controversy had to involve an IRL driver on one side and a kart driver on the other side. In the closing stages, 2001 winner Helio Castroneves was stretching his fuel mileage in an attempt to score back-to-back wins for Roger Penske, but he was being hunted down in the closing laps by Team Green's Paul Tracy, who'd famously, as we mentioned in the last episode, called the IRL cars crap wagons. And as far as I can tell, he was the only crossover driver I spotted who, in the pre-race coverage before this race, he was the one who made a reference to wanting to do kart proud by going up against the IRL guys. As we said in the last episode, everyone else seemed to come over and be very magnanimous and not want to make it about the split. Not sure that was Paul Tracy's way. But as Tracy pulled out to pass Castroneves at turn 3 on the penultimate lap. There was a crash between Laurent Redon and Buddy Lazier in turn 2 behind them, which brought out a full course caution. Castroneves then crawled home under yellow to make sure he didn't run out of fuel so he could actually take the checkered flag, claiming another Indy 500 victory for Penske. Meanwhile, Tracy thought he was the winner, believing he had passed Castroneves before the yellow lights came on in reaction to the crash behind them at turn 2. Tracy and Team Green immediately said they would protest the result. That was rejected, I think, the next day by Chief Steward Brian Barnhart, who declared Castroneves the winner. Team Green disputed that, so they appealed the decision. John, we'll get into the appeal and the specific evidence that was brought forward in a moment. But at the time, on the day, what was the feeling around this? Did Castroneves' second win almost feel inconclusive in the moment?
I think so. There was tremendous confusion at the end of the race, and obviously this all unfolded over the space of, if you want to look at from the yellow flag to the pass, we're talking a matter of a second or two at the very most. But all of this, because it happened toward the end of the 198th lap, they were basically in the last 2 minutes of this race anyway. And so they had 2 slow yellow flag laps to try to resolve this. And there are pictures of the scoring tower that show Tracy's car leading the field and the number 26 at the top of the scoring pylon. Because as they came by on the 199th lap, Tracy had completed the pass. He was in front of the field. It was the height of the direct animosity, Indy 500 animosity between CART and IRL, because you had more of the CART guys there, and they just dominated. The 2 guys in 2000, Montoya especially, and in 2001 when they took the first 6 positions, all the rhetoric was just dialed up to the max. And it was a CART versus IRL thing, except the guy that won for CART the year before was now flying the IRL flag. And it's the most stunning thing, or not surprising if you followed this over the years, was just how, for the IRL, Penske was the enemy until the day that he joined the IRL, and suddenly he was the all-conquering hero and everybody loved him. And so to see the shift in philosophy for, the IRL crying in their beer in 2001 when Castroneves won, to fighting as hard as possible to keep Castroneves the winner in 2002, the shift in optics was the biggest thing. And it was very, very, very raw and real in the aftermath of the 2000 Indy 500. It was a very, very hard set of circumstances to sift through because nobody is neutral about this. The Associated Press, claims to be the ultimate neutral arbiter, and even the most neutral media sources had some kind of skin in this game, some kind of attitude about who should or should be, And I think just that it all kind of came to a head with this result. This was the symbolic clash here of all the ill feelings that had built up, you could say over the past 6 or 8 years or all the way back to the 60s and when the foreign invasion came in. But this is kind of where it all came to a head. And unfortunately, it was there on video evidence for all to see that maybe the result that was declared was not the rightful result.
Yeah, we're gonna dig into this quite a lot, although not in full, as you'll find out in a minute why we can't do that. But IRL boss Tony George decided he would hear the big appeal himself in June, and he said afterwards that even though the position of the cars at the commencement of a caution period is a judgment decision not subject to protest or appeal, he decided to allow the appeal to be heard because of the unique facts and circumstances of this situation, and because Indy was the biggest single-day sporting event in the world. Ed, given the political background to this, given all the stuff John has just mapped out for us, was it odd that Tony George, of all people, would be the one ultimately ruling on it?
Yeah, it's beyond odd. It's lunacy, really, because he's saying that we're going to go through the facts of this for the kind of integrity of the Indy 500, and then making himself the judge, jury, and executioner, regardless of how he approached it. He could have approached it in the most dispassionate, disinterested, correct way possible, and he still the figurehead of one side of what's become a political thing. So it's completely insane. Genuinely, it's ridiculous because it centered the political side of it, when actually what you want to do is say, right, this is about the facts. Let's distill it down, get it independently judged. And I'm not sure exactly who would be the obvious person to do it, but you try and find somebody who either is seen to have a foot in both camps and can be dispassionate, or is disconnected but with the skills to rule on it, because it's just ridiculous, because it just gives fuel to the fire, doesn't it, when you've got Tony George making the decisions on it. So I don't understand why he was in a position where he thought this was a good idea, and why someone didn't say to him, come on, that's lunacy. That's just really, really stupid. So whether it's sort of hubris on his part that he thought he was untouchable or felt that he was the keeper of the spirit of the Indy 500 and was therefore unimpeachable, I don't know. But certainly he wasn't seen as that. So that decision to hear it himself is something that means this is still such a big talking point, hotly debated and still argued about even by those involved to this day.
Yeah, I mean, you sent me an Instagram post the other day, didn't you, about this, that's got Helio Castroneves is the top comment on it, arguing with people that say that Paul Tracy won this race. So as you said, everybody involved is still bothered by it to this day. John just talked about the fact that kind of any observer of this had skin in the game. Nobody had more skin in the game by this point than Tony George, and he's decided that he's going to be the person to rule on it. But let's get to the ruling, and I'm going to do my best. I said you'll find out why we can't do the whole thing. I'm going to try and summarise here a 5,000 word judgment released by George after the ruling as quickly as I can. So bear with me for a second. The appeal was rejected on those original grounds that I mentioned already, that the order of the cars upon the commencement of a caution period is a judgment call and is not protestable or appealable. But how did we get there? To pick out some highlights, the verdict said that a caution is communicated by 4 methods: radio instructions from race control that the teams are required to monitor, trackside yellow lights, dashboard yellow lights in the cars, and yellow flags being waved. The IRL said that competitors are always told to react to the first of these that they see, not to continue racing until a particular one is shown. In a minute, we'll come back to why that's tricky as well. Team Green's case was based on Tracy being ahead when the trackside lights came on, but the IRL determined that Castroneves was ahead at the time of the accident, the time race control called the caution over the radio, the time a red flag with a yellow cross was shown at pit entry to denote the pits being closed because there was a caution, the time that the signal for the dashboard light system was activated, the last timing line before the yellow flag period commenced, and the time that the yellow light on Castroneves' dashboard came on, having received that signal. Tracy's car didn't have the data acquisition on board to determine when his yellow light came on, and it was acknowledged that there could be a small variation in how quickly a car's cockpit lights reacted to the signal being sent. Team Green's argument was that Tracy was 4 to 6 feet ahead of Castroneves when the trackside light came on, but George's verdict called this argument misplaced, because the idea that you race until you see a specific signal for a caution goes against the notion that a caution is called for safety reasons and you should slow as soon as any of the signals are seen or heard. George called Team Green's tremendous emphasis on the trackside lights an argument that was contrary to the terms and clear intent of the rules, and said that telling drivers to wait only for the trackside lights, which could fail, would be extraordinarily dangerous. There was also a great bit where George kind of accepts that Tracy was slightly ahead, quote, based on an imaginary start-finish line in the middle of turn 3 when the trackside lights came on. But he countered that as Castroneves, I love this, Castroneves was on the inside, he would have had a 10 to 12 foot shorter distance to the finish line at that point. I love the idea of running around on the white line and having a shorter distance to the end. Before I wrap this up, I want to pick out some other phrases that are used in the verdict in relation to the Team Green case. I'll summarise these. Things like George saying their effort to second guess the decision is inconsistent with the purpose of the rules. Team Green's interpretation of the rules is not logical. He uses the phrase not logical a lot in this verdict. He says its argument violates the purpose and intent of the rules, is contrary to the rules, is not technically sound, is not supported by the rule book, and that some of the claims were not well grounded. He praised Team Green and Penske for the professionalism they have demonstrated throughout this process, but ultimately his ruling was that there was ample evidence to support the determination that Castroneves was ahead of Tracy at the commencement of the caution period. I'm going to come back to how Team Green responded to the verdict in a minute and why they were so obsessed with the yellow lights argument. But before we do that, John, Paul Tracy says he got screwed. Do you agree?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, plain and simple. My take is that if the IRL didn't tear up their rule book to create the result they wanted, they simply didn't use their rule book. Tracy got screwed. It was political. It was ridiculous, the notion of Tony George appointing himself to create a verdict, an unwinnable case for Barry Green. And I think we'll follow up on this a bit. You know, Barry Green basically wrote a check for $500,000 and lit it on fire. And his reaction to losing was swift and severe. But for Tracy, you know, he held it as a badge of honor. He has, for nearly 25 years, believed that he is the rightful winner of the 2002 Indy 500. There's a sizable piece of the fan base out there that thinks he is. To me, the most notable piece of evidence was Sam Hornish Jr. on his in-car radio. Sam Hornish was right behind Tracy and Castroneves when it happened. He saw the light come on. He saw the pass happen. Sam Hornish gets on his radio and says, Paul Tracy just won the Indy 500. And there's a guy that, you know, that was your one already IRL champion, soon to be again IRL champion that season. So for Sam Hornish to make that observation, I think says a lot. Tracy, to his credit, I believe handled it very well over the last 23 years. And when I was doing the new book, the Class of 99 book, you know, Paul was a big player in 99 still. And I talked to him about this. And his reaction was, you know, kids, they know that feeling, and maybe basketball isn't such a big thing in the UK, but they know that feeling of being in the backyard and they've got the imaginary clock counting down and they shoot the three-point basket that goes in as the buzzer goes off and they win the game. And Paul Tracy's take is very simple. He says, I don't have the trophy, but I know what it feels like to win the Indy 500.
It's a really strange situation, the whole thing, because I think, coming back to the question that you asked, John, I do think Tracy was screwed insofar as if that race had run normally, I think he'd have won. I think that's clear. So the Redon Lazier crash did him for that. What I find strange about the whole thing is it should be a fairly simple question deciding what actually happened here, shouldn't it? There's a point where I know there was a point of contention about, you know, is it the point where the caution's called, where lights come on, etc. But all of that should exist in data. You've got both sides claiming they've got data proving different things. Penske say Castroneves lifted before the pass. Team Green say they can prove that they've got data that proves it's not the case. And you only need a few data points that are then published and put out there to establish the order. Because if you look at it, it does sit, because I sort of tend towards the kind of emotional argument is, yeah, Paul Tracy was screwed out of it, but it's going to have been really close because you just have this instant moment. One moment it's green, the next moment it's yellow. Where is he in terms of actually making that pass? And looking at what's publicly available, the timeline, because they cut in the live coverage to the kind of the end of that shunt with Redon and Lazier kind of slowing down, having had the shunt. So it seems, certainly the yellow would have been called before the pass had happened. Exactly when it kicks in is unclear, but we just don't have all of this data lined up. And I wouldn't be surprised if all the data's public and clear, that it might actually show the pass did happen after the yellow was both called and counting. But the fact that the whole thing's been done so messily with stuff not made public, with Tony George in charge, makes it just seem ridiculous. And I almost wonder whether, I'm switching codes here, but I remember if we go back to the whole Suzuka 89 stuff in Formula One, and all the stuff Balestra was doing, if they'd actually paid attention to the rules and what had happened, there was a much, much easier way to get the outcome that they may or may not have wanted. And I almost wonder whether there was this desire to kind of prove that the IRL team had won, not the kart team. But actually, they didn't need to, because perhaps the facts show that was the case. It would have been a split second either way. So you just see this whole thing as this enormous farrago, and to this day, there's not kind of a really satisfactory answer, and you can't see in the footage and the public data with absolute certainty. I do think the one weak point in the Green case is that thing about that they're worried about the trackside stuff rather than the in-cockpit stuff, which I'd imagine would have been relatively new at that stage, but they did cite that they exactly, yeah. And we still get arguments today about this, say in Formula One, about the difference between the trackside, the lights, the flags, the dashboard stuff. So that would have been part of it, but they do cite in the decision there was a case of another race which kind of instantly went yellow as soon as the lights came on the dash. So there's all this stuff going on that could be so easily solved and made clear. And it's the fact that it's so messy that even though I look at it and think, well, maybe Castroneves did win, but the way it's been done, George doing it, the verdict, the lack of the publicly available evidence and the conflicts in it kind of builds up this narrative. So it's so badly handled across the board and creates such an unsatisfactory answer that you almost have to answer it alongside battle lines, don't you, rather than actually what is the moment. It should be so easy. And obviously there were arguments about how the rulebook should be interpreted, the intent of the rules, etc. But it should be so easy to know exactly where those cars are relative to each other at the point that the caution was called and counted. And I find it bizarre that it was so muddy, which kind of feeds into the narrative that Tracy was robbed. But I do wonder, with what you can see from the timeline, if actually that didn't need to happen and maybe Castroneves did win. But yeah, unsatisfactory every way you look at it.
So why were Team Green so hung up on this yellow light argument? After Tony George's verdict came out, Barry Green spoke to the media and said that Rule 7.14 in the IRL rulebook says that racing will cease with the display of the yellow flag or the yellow light. So he felt all the claims about the other signals of a caution period starting were irrelevant because that wasn't what the rulebook said. Green said he couldn't see one reason why we didn't win the race, saying they used the IRL's own data, plus the video footage of the moments in question, and testimony from other drivers and trackside spotters that all showed Tracy was ahead. He added that he was very disappointed in Tony George and the IRL, and that he felt George had lost his way here. Roger Penske said he hated to see the race end like that, and he didn't blame Team Green for trying everything they can, but he said it was unfortunate a situation like this comes up and then people take sides. As for Tracy, in the wake of the announcement, he said, "I feel that I won the race, but we weren't able to win the political side of it." He said it was frustrating that it came down to politics, which he called sad for the sport. And he added, "I think it just shows how deep the gap is between the IRL and kart. It's so wide now that it's frustrating." John, do you think that's the case? Did this ultimately, regardless of all the facts and all the data and all the stuff that Ed said wasn't necessarily put together very well, did this ultimately boil down to an IRL versus kart issue? Was that the key deciding factor in the outcome?
I think so. I don't think you can escape that conclusion. I think, as you went through the IRL's justification, it all kind of sounded like gibberish made up to try to prove a point. And while Barry Green's evidence was used to prove a point, it seemed a lot more plausible and believable. And I don't, especially with the way Tony installed himself as the judge here, by doing that, he made the politics front and center. Because a judge is supposed to be an impartial arbitrator. And there was nothing impartial about Tony George's position at that point in time. I mean, you could argue that, who the hell was running kart in 2002? I don't even remember. It's so irrelevant at this point. But I mean, if the kart guy had judged it and somehow come out with Tracy as the winner, the outrage would have been the same, just because the political impact of it was so much a part of it. It could not be avoided, and the only way it could have been avoided would have been with a truly independent voice making a ruling, and that simply didn't happen. And it never was going to happen, frankly.
And it seems bizarre, again, coming back to George being front and centre of this. He's not the guy to sell the decision, is he? He's not sold it well. It's not written well. The whole thing just seems comedically badly done across the board, really. And you're right, it becomes a political thing, because almost the facts of the case cease to be relevant, and it's turned into this big showpiece battle. And yeah, I just don't really see how the whole thing could have been done worse, really. It seems completely insane.
Yeah, and you said there Tony George can't be impartial, and that's fine. Like it's fine for him to not be impartial, because as we said, he's got a lot of skin in this game. This game exists because of what he did. So you wouldn't criticize him for that. But what you can criticize him for is putting himself in charge of making the decision. That's utterly bizarre. I've never had a conclusive feeling either way on this. So doing this series, having read John's book previously and looking up other stuff around it, reading the decision in full for the first time, was quite illuminating. I would say I'm still not convinced either way what the right answer is, which says a lot about the case. But I do feel it my takeaway really is that if the IRL's rules had been written better to reflect all the things they said in the judgment, we probably would be okay. And you probably would go, okay, it's Castroneves. But unfortunately, you've got the IRL trying to argue that, okay, the rule says this, but what we actually mean is this. And lawyers eat that stuff up. So, if there had been impartial judges on this who had a proper understanding of legal phrasing and the way laws and rules and contracts work, they probably would have said, it's great that you told everybody to react to the call on the radio and that all the teams have to monitor that, and you said this in the team briefings before the event, but your rules don't say that. So I can understand why Team Green latched onto that. I can also understand it's very dangerous to say there are 4 or 5 signals of a caution, but you can keep racing until you see that one, because that's the only one that's in our rules, which is effectively what the badly written rules say. So, yeah, absolute shambles. Brilliant controversy, though, and a fun way to start off this episode.
I think in the verdict, they do concede that the yellows on the dash aren't guaranteed to come on simultaneously in all cars. So that does kind of show that if that is the arbiter of it, which I think the rules kind of would say, then it shouldn't be the arbiter of it if your light's coming on at a different time in different cockpits, because that's just not a functional system. So it also just speaks to what you were saying there about just not being very well structured and thought out and implemented, and just creating ambiguity.
We do have to recall that telemetry and technology in 2002 is not what it was. It's not what it is today. And the other thing, too, is that, you guys are coming at it from a Formula One perspective, where IndyCar racing was in 2002 was, 5-10 years behind Formula One in terms of that kind of technology. So they did what they could with the information that was available, but not all of it was available in the public domain. And my understanding is that Penske was very reticent about releasing data and resisted as much as possible.
It's a good point. It's a long time ago. The days of, they're able to, whether it's NASCAR, IndyCar, whatever, you can freeze a field with the press of a button now on live timing. It's a lot easier to do. But let's move on. We could do a full episode about this, and if we're not careful, we're going to do that by accident. There's lots more we want to get through here. And by the start of the following season in 2003, more teams had followed Penske in defecting to the IRL. The most high profile of these were Ganassi leaving kart entirely after having a brief spell of running cars in both series, Team Green sold to Michael Andretti to rebrand as Andretti Green Racing. They came over with 3 cars. Team Rahal ran a car in each series that year before switching fully to the IRL in 2004. I think that's when Fernandez came over as well, Adrian Fernandez. Just as significantly though, and John talked about this in our last episode, 2 manufacturers switched series, with Toyota and Honda leaving kart and pitching up in the IRL to take on Chevrolet. Meanwhile in kart, the main 2 teams that stayed loyal were Newman Haas and Forsyth. More on them later. Ed, what did you think of how the IRL grid was shaping up now in 2003 with more kart big hitters?
Yeah, 2003 is kind of the inflection point in terms of what you're getting on track, I think. That I tend to think of 2003 as almost the first proper IRL season when stuff's really started to come together.
It was the first truly professional season for the IRL.
Yeah, absolutely, and that made it the kind of must-watch. And being somebody who loved kart, champ car, what happened there in 2003 was clearly a diminished championship as well. It's great that Paul Tracy got his title, but it's the start of what I sort of consider to be the sort of the moribund kart series. You can't call it kart series throughout that to the end, but technically, it's kind of the dying days of that championship, and you could just feel it. And when I was at Autosport at the time, I wasn't dealing with this sort of stuff. I was doing national racing, etc. But you could just see in terms of the way the coverage was dealt with, the report allocation and the news stories, etc. The centre of gravity had shifted to the IRL for good.
John, to pick up on what you talked about in the last episode, what was more significant here? Was it the team names coming over that we all recognise from kart, or was it actually those manufacturers coming over? Which was more important?
The manufacturers by far, because what had happened in kart at the very end of the 90s through the early 00s is the manufacturers overtook the sponsors in terms of being the economic engine of the series, and it started with Toyota. Toyota came in and just broke the mold. Toyota started paying teams to be Toyota teams instead of the model to that point is that the teams would lease their engine programs from Honda, Ford, Cosworth, Mercedes, and Toyota at first. But Toyota, after struggling in their first 3 or 4 years, they just solved the problem with money. They improved their product, and they threw a lot of money at Chip Ganassi to switch sides. Ultimately, over the next couple of years, they did the same with Pat Patrick with Newman Haas, and this very much alarmed Honda. Honda did not want to play the game that way. They were perfectly happy taking teams' money rather than paying their teams. But ultimately, starting with Team Green in 2002, Honda was forced to respond in kind. But by 2002, the key that had happened was that Honda in particular had lost confidence in kart's management. Kart ousted Andrew Craig in mid-2000. It took him 6 months to find a successor. Joe Heitzler was a disaster. His tenure lasted exactly 1 year, from December 2000 to December 2001. And kart's implosion happened in 2001. The Brazil race was canceled. They had this fiasco at Texas where a race was canceled because they were going too fast and the drivers were blacking out. Honda made the decision by the end of 2001 to leave kart, and they at that point had no idea what they were going to do. Going to the IRL wasn't part of their plan. But through kind of a marriage of convenience, Honda took over the Ilmor IRL program, the engine that Ilmor was developing independently. And it gave Honda a means to enter the IRL faster than it would have been had it been able to develop its own engine for 2003. So Toyota's wielding this economic clout. Toyota essentially got kart to commit to IRL rules briefly in 2001 before Jerry Forsyth led a revolt. It all happened so much in that period where Honda and Toyota left, and Cosworth, thankfully, they stepped up and agreed to build a spec engine for the kart series. But, now you've gone from the IRL being lampooned as a spec series in the early years, and suddenly kart's the spec series. So the shift in this period from 2000 to 2004, it was just It was a phenomenal tidal wave. I mean, the entire balance of power shifted very suddenly in that 1 to 2 year period, to the point where, CART literally went bankrupt, and had to reform themselves out of the ashes as Champ Car.
Yeah, so while Ganassi's Scott Dixon won the 2003 IRL titles, once again the Penske drivers were narrowly defeated that year. By this point, as John's hinted at there, CART was really just limping towards oblivion. CART's losses had accelerated at a frightening rate. I'm quoting John's book here, from $1.5 million of losses in 2001, $21 million in 2002, and in the summer of 2003, the company acknowledged that at its current rate of spending, it would not have the necessary funding to continue in 2004. In August 2003, a group of investors, led by Forsyth team owner Jerry Forsyth, was set to buy CART under the Open Wheel Racing Series banner, with the aim of turning it back into a thriving series. But that plan changed at the end of the year, with, I believe, the OWRS group proposing that it would actually buy CART's key assets, with CART then filing for bankruptcy. And we'll get into what that led to in a moment. Ed, as a big CART fan, though, in its heyday, as I was, as the race's Matt Beer was, and Matt's not on this series, but he'll be keenly listening, I'm sure. How difficult was it to watch that decline that John has just described there for what was once the dominant series?
Yeah, it was it was not particularly fun, because you'd still kind of, when you could watch it out of habit, as I say, I was covering a lot of other racing and at that time, so wasn't always in the right place to watch the races live. But the racing also often wasn't very good either. That's the really bad thing. I mean, there were still some good drivers in that championship right to the end, actually, but it just felt empty. It felt like a very pale imitation of what it once was. And you kind of thought, well, 10 years ago, it was all on the up. It was fantastic championship. But I think it was the speed of the decline as well, because I hadn't realised quite how weak it was becoming. And there was a lot of, CART missed opportunities as well. Yeah, they didn't have the 500, but all this dithering endlessly on engine formulas played a part in the manufacturers moving and the money falling apart. And then you actually look at it, and John outlines this very well in Indy Split. You end up with the Champ Car series turning into kind of what IRL was criticised as, because they were shelling out huge amounts of money to competitors just to kind of keep the thing propped up, and it was no longer paying for itself. So all of that promise had dissolved, because it didn't have the viewership, it didn't have the manufacturers, the sponsorship, the commercial partners, all the things you need for a thriving championship. And then you end up with this long, drawn out, slow death. And yeah, while there's worthy champions all the way to the end, it becomes a very, very patchy series. I remember going to actually one of the last races at Assen, which would have been 2007, and that was pretty. That was a pretty. It just lacked energy, and everything had been whittled away to the point where you just have this. It's almost an empty carcass of a series, which is such a shame considering where it had been and where it should have gone on to be.
Did you say that was Assen in 2007?
Yeah.
Now here's the funny thing. I did that tour, the Z to A tour. It was Zolder and Assen, and I thought Zolder was just flat and dead. Assen, on the other hand, I actually wrote a column. I'm like, hey, there's hope for Champ Car. They put on a professional race. 60,000 people showed up. Justin Wilson won. It looked good. And it's interesting to have that deferring perspective there. And maybe it was just me drinking the Champ Car Kool-Aid at that point, through my, purple Kool-Aid tinted glasses. But I thought Assen, it was actually the last gasp. And just as a personal anecdote about that, they housed everybody for Assen at this resort called the Hof van Sachsen, everybody in the CART community. And it was a brand new resort, and everybody was in these kind of dorm things. And in the evenings, a bunch of the media and PR people would get together, and we'd have barbecues. And it was a really great festive time that we had there in Holland. And I felt that had we known at the time, this is September of 2007, had we known that, the end was coming for Champ Car in 4 months, that it would have been like a funeral, that it wouldn't have had, this positive atmosphere. But for those of us who kind of stayed loyal to the Champ Car side, Awesome actually was positive. It was, there was kind of a roadmap for the future there. And as somebody that as a kid wanted to cover Formula One, the opportunity to go around the world and cover car racing was a pretty sweet deal.
It's actually a really interesting difference in perspective there. I guess that probably tells you how much it had been dragged down. But...
I know it was gray and cool and everything, but, I thought there was a decent crowd. And overall, I took it as a positive for Champ Car.
Well, there was, you're right, there was a big crowd. I've got to ask you, though, do you remember the national anthem? Because that's always stuck in my mind.
I don't. I remember, kind of freezing in the drizzle, standing on the, the Garrett Timmer Tribune. But I don't specifically remember that. Maybe you can jar my memory.
Well, I always remember it because, and there at least were a couple of videos of this on YouTube taken by the crowd. Because I don't know exactly what happened, but I can only assume they forgot to have somebody to do the national anthem. Because American sporting events, they just love a national anthem. Just every single one, national anthem. And I can only assume they didn't think to do this because you ended up with what appeared to be the circuit commentator attempting to sing it and not well. And it's one of the funniest things. I always remember it. Do have a search on YouTube if you can find it.
I've got to do that.
It was unbelievable, and it's just always stuck in my mind. I just remember being there. I was there with Andrew van der Berg, who's now obviously the big boss at the race. We were both over there with Autosport, and it was just so funny. But yeah, there was a big crowd, that was true. And it wasn't a great race either because we were in the way the fuel windows worked and everything. There's a lot of fuel mileage management going on, etc. So also the on-track product was a little bit underwhelming as well. So, but I'm really interested. You say that felt like a kind of last hurrah for it, because perhaps that reflected coming from a European perspective, not having been to a kart race for some years at that point.
I think that's a fascinating, just kind of difference of perspective there.
I can't say I knew what was coming, but
nor did we. That's the thing, and I talked to Cal Coven pretty regularly throughout all this, but and once it became clear it was happening, he's like, you got to keep this on the QT because Tony's just super paranoid about leaks. So
we'll skip forward about 4 years to get to that moment towards the end of this episode, but to move back to January 2004. This was when kart's assets were going up for auction. The OWRS Group offered $1.6 million to buy various kart assets and pledged to pay prize money and other liabilities that would bring the total outlay to around $3 million. They also promised to hold at least 15 races in 2004 with at least 18 cars on the grid. Crucially, the bid was also structured in a way that required any competing bidders to make an effort to continue the series. Why was that important? Because the Indy Racing League was sniffing around the kart assets too. The IRL's bid was for more than double the amount of money offered by OWRS, although it was only really interested in the Long Beach race contract, the pool of Ford Cosworth engines and some other equipment. Tony George said his goal was to work quickly and effectively to create a unified series, although many of his opponents interpreted that to mean his goal was simply to kill off what was left of kart and Champ Car. Paul Tracy, who, as we mentioned, had won the kart title finally in 2003, he was one of those to speak up, saying George never wanted to get together, he just wanted to kill kart. The judge overseeing the auction of kart's assets ruled in favour of the OWRS bid, calling it the best business judgment to breathe new life into an organisation to compete with the IRL. George said he was disappointed with that outcome, believing it was a missed opportunity to unify the two series, and he warned that he didn't see much chance of a reborn kart series being successful, as he didn't believe the economy could support two championships by the early 2000s. John, ultimately, was this a missed opportunity to just absorb whatever was left of this kind of dying kart entity, absorb that into the IRL and just be done with the split?
Yes, I think it prolonged the inevitable, but there was enough hope on the Champ Car side and enough money, particularly from Jerry Forsyth. And Jerry Forsyth went after the Champ Car era with the same sort of zeal that Tony George and the same sort of resentment that Tony George started the IRL with. I think the last 4 years were an expensive pissing match, frankly. And you see that when the unification finally happened, it basically took shape the way people predicted it would have in 2004, where Long Beach and Toronto were really the only things that they were after. The IRL formula won out the 2003 Dallara, as opposed to the car that Champ Car introduced in 2007, the Panos DP01, which I thought looked like a glorified Formula 3000 car at the time, but it's kind of grown on me, and it was a better looking and better sounding car than the Dallara Honda IRL car. It did kind of push back, and there were some moments over the next 4 years that are memorable, and it kind of launched the career of Sebastian Bourdais and AJ Allmendinger, who kind of came and went in a hurry, but it did just kind of avoid what everyone could see coming eventually.
So what was now known as the Champ Car World Series limped on with its aging Lola Cosworth cars, and the IRL took its next step to basically turning into what kart used to be. It already had most of the teams and their dreaded foreign drivers, and the manufacturers have come over as well. So the next thing to add was road courses. In 2005, 3 road course races were added to the schedule. The season would start at the St. Petersburg event, which had been a kart race in 2003. Later in the year, the IRL would race at Watkins Glen and Sonoma as well. Tony George called the addition of some right turns to the schedule the start of a new era for the league. He said he'd always been interested in adding road courses to the IRL's all-oval schedule, and if and when the right opportunity presented itself. And then he said, and this is a weird quote, but he said, "Fortunately or unfortunately, I don't know, it has taken us until now to work out a deal and add them." I am endlessly fascinated in a strange way by Tony George's almost inability to speak in public. But anyway, the move went down well with the former kart teams and drivers. Michael Andretti, whose company co-promoted the St. Petersburg race, said this showed the direction the series needs to go, and he felt George was now sold on that. And one of his drivers, Tony Kanaan, said that as soon as the IRL went to a road course race, it felt like we were back in the old days to be racing on a street track again. For these drivers, for many of them, it's the first time since 2002 for the guys who were in the 2003 influx of kart teams to IRL. Ed, it's 2005. We've got IRL cars racing on road courses. Were you pleased with this development?
Yeah, very much so. I was with Tony Kanaan on this. One of the great things about kart in the 90s was that blend of oval, street and road courses. And I think IndyCar is at its best when it's got a good even split of that. And I mean, I love oval racing, but it's great to have the multidiscipline challenges. However, it is bizarre, isn't it? Because if you go back to what we were saying at the start of it, Tony George creates this series. He wants it to be oval only. He wants it to be connected to the sprint racing and midget racing and bring through American drivers, wants to stop having overseas drivers stealing everybody's jobs, doesn't want all the manufacturer money and technology, all these things. And IRL is now firmly on its way to becoming exactly that, only a much more diminished version of what it once was. So either Tony George has had a road to Damascus moment along the journey, or it just shows that all of the pretext for doing this originally was just that, and actually it was just about shoring up the control and primacy of the Indy 500. So if you're looking at the politics, it makes you raise your eyebrow and say, well, what the hell was the point in all of this? But in terms of the actual product, good for the championship, definitely.
It's funny, one of the loudest complainers about this glorious new era for the IRL was Eddie Cheever, who was one of the original guys, kart guys, that landed in the IRL in the early days. And you know, Eddie Cheever never won a Formula One race, and he never won a race in kart, but he's an Indy 500 winner now. And Cheever, he used to derisively call, when in his early IRL days, he'd call kart Formula One Light. And suddenly he was forced to call the IRL kart light, because that's what it had become. And Cheever, after being, you know, a giant, a guy that won a few races and became a marquee name by IRL standards, suddenly found himself as a minnow again by 2005. And so he's an interesting example to cite as just how the philosophy of the IRL shifted to suit its needs over the years. People used to say to me at that time, what's the biggest difference between covering a kart race or a champ car race and an IRL race? And my answer was simple. You can have a conversation at a champ car race because the cars are turbo and they're much quieter. But other than that, it's essentially the same. There may be some bigger sponsors in those days in the IRL, because you had Target and the likes of that, Philip Morris, Marlboro, what they were allowed to do. But otherwise, the schedule just morphed into the old kart schedule.
As we build towards the end of our story here, then, let's talk unification. And initially that means another spree of failed attempts at putting the two series back together. We talked in the last episode about the discussions that took place at the end of the 90s that never went anywhere. But as the 2000s wore on, there were many more attempts. Roger Penske tried to facilitate talks in 2004. But after the two sides met, they released a joint statement where they said there was agreement that one series would be the optimal situation. Duh. But it is the belief of all the people involved that the time is not right for further discussion. In early 2006, George said he was optimistic that something would be possible, before adding, we're a long way from there at the moment, and warning people not to get their hopes up. On the Champ Car side, Kevin Kalkoven was pretty positive as well, stressing the importance of getting it done right and not putting a time limit on it. He said discussions were continuing with the best intent to get it done in the best way possible. Yet later in that same year, he changed his tune, saying that optimistic stories in June of a deal being close were blown out of proportion, and that culturally, the two organisations are very far apart, so it is now a dead issue. That prompted Mario Andretti, who had been the one facilitating these talks, to say he almost cried, and he accused both sides of being in denial. And Scott Dixon, who, as we mentioned, won that IRL title after switching over in 2003 with Ganassi, said he felt it was never going to happen, even though it was what everybody wanted. John, during these years where Champ Car's trying to build itself back up, the IRL, as we've just described, is turning into what Champ Car used to be. Did you ever get your hopes up that any of these attempts at unification were actually going to go anywhere?
It seemed like there were rumors of it every 6 months. And ultimately, to me, the best thing I can equate it to is the old fable of the boy who cried wolf. And these guys, they kept dangling unification in front of us and pulling it away, and you know, by the end of 2007, you just kind of resigned yourself to, you know, giving up. But the most fascinating thing that came out of all this is that Tony George and Kevin Kalkoven became friends. And they found that they enjoyed socializing with each other. So it took the better part of 2 years, but a couple of years of, you know, ski trips and things like that. I think they both finally saw the writing on the wall and finally realized that they were throwing good money after bad, and they were able to put together a very IRL-centric unification.
Yeah, I'll admit, as a fan of US racing, and by this point, working at Autosport, editing the news pages of the magazine, I'm sure that's going to come up again in a minute, probably via Ed. I was kind of feeling like unification was never going to happen. As you say, it was this thing that would get dangled and then politics or egos would get in the way. I just thought we're going to be here forever until one of these series, and it was pretty obvious which one it was going to be, dies. But then, in early 2008, it finally happened in a way. As John mentioned earlier, word got out that George and Kalkoven had reached an agreement for their series to move forward as a single entity. And after a few weeks of wobbles and claims that the talks were stalling, and that I think comes back to what John said earlier about being worried about leaks and a lot of paranoia, it became official on February the 22nd, 2008. The IRL would acquire and or merge key elements of Champ Car into the IndyCar series, and Champ Car would cease to exist. Kalkoven said it had been a long and hard road to get to this point, but he felt this was an exciting time for open wheel racing in North America, and he said the winners today are the fans, the teams, and the drivers. He said he hoped that everyone would realise this was a very conscious decision to take IndyCar racing forward in a very positive way. Tony George said he never liked to take all the blame, so I don't like to take all the credit either. And he said his goal was to bring everybody together. He talked of the unified series needing good leadership that makes good decisions that are in everybody's best interest, not one group's best interest. And he said he would do his best to keep together what has taken us so long to put together. Reflecting on the situation years later in John's Indy Split book, Chip Ganassi said unification was something that had to be done because everybody knew that if we weren't careful, we would be two factions who were like two bald men fighting over a comb. So, John, what made the difference this time? Why did it finally come together in 2008 after so many previous attempts had failed?
By this point, you've got these dueling 18-car series that are accomplishing nothing. And this was Kalkoven winning over Forsyth because I think Forsyth was absolutely keen to continue. And Forsyth, it's typical of the guy that when it did come together, he paid Paul Tracy not to race the rest of the year. There was definitely a vindictive streak in Jerry Forsyth throughout all this. But Kalkoven ultimately was the voice of reason that prevailed. And as I said, it was, this wasn't a merger of equals. This wasn't a unification. This was essentially the IRL absorbing Champ Car, taking what it wanted. A few races. The medical team was a key thing. The Champ Car all the way back to the kart era were pioneers in terms of at-track medical services and things like that. So it was kind of a hollow victory. Here we are now. We're together, but what form is it going to take? What shape is it going to take? And how successful is it going to be? What's going to become of these 18 cars, drivers, teams, blah, 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 that made up Champ Car at that point that had expected to go racing at a very interesting, diverse international schedule for 2008 that was going to go to Jerez and back to Austin and places like that. There was definitely an optimistic, and Champ Car at that point, I think, were really having to differentiate themselves from the IRL as opposed to trying to, continue as what the old kart was. It was much more of an international thing, but it never got off the ground in that form. Obviously, Kalkoven saw the expenses that were coming, and so the glorious unified era began.
Yeah, we're back together, but at what cost? Ed, you and I were in a brief stint together as partners in crime on the Autosport magazine news desk when this happened. I know that we've joked between ourselves that we reunited US open wheel racing and then went our separate ways. At the time, how excited were you when the news came through that this wasn't just another rumour that it might happen? This time it was actually happening.
Yeah, this was just before I headed off to do Formula One full time. But yeah, well, I remember when the stories were floating around actually being very nonplussed by it and thinking it was very much, oh yeah, we've heard this time and time and time again. And my memory of it, and I think we had discussions about that as well, because obviously we were working out what to put in the news pages, which were still kind of the centrepiece of Autosport Mag at that time. But I remember speaking to David Malsher, who was covering Champ Car for us, who said, no, actually, this is real. And I think he certainly did some stuff for us in that issue. And I think probably speaking to Robin Miller as well, who occasionally did bits and pieces for us.
That was the penny dropping for us. I remember, I think you maybe put the phone down. You went, okay, Robin Miller says it's definitely happening. Like, we're tearing up our plans.
Yeah, it's and it was that kind of thing. Because as John said, it was just this cry wolf situation endlessly. You're like, yeah. And it was really close to the start.
Tedious.
Yeah.
The way it just kept happening and not happening. It was just, it didn't serve anybody, and it made them all look bad.
Exactly. And because of that tedium, you just thought, yeah, same old, this isn't going to happen. So close to the start of the season, this isn't practical. And then bang, it did happen. And actually, the moment you thought, oh, this is actually happening, that was quite exciting, because finally you thought, well, this is all going to be over and everything's going to be brilliant again, which may get on to how brilliant things really were later. But that's the thing I really remember, just not believing it was the case. And then suddenly this, oh, okay, it is actually happening. And basically it's because nobody could keep on doing this. And one side had, to all intents and purposes, been a dead man walking for several years by this point anyway. So it wasn't a very... It was forced by necessity rather than optimal reunification, but it was a big deal, and yeah, it was the thing that everybody had waited for so long, and yet just believed would never happen. So yeah, always very much very, very strong in my memory. Certainly the feeling of that, even if I couldn't remember exactly who spoke to who and when.
Yeah, it was the fact that it was such a big deal internationally. This wasn't just a US racing story. I think the international audience maybe got a bit fed up of the politics, and not as much of that in the later years made its way kind of across the Atlantic, for want of a better phrase. But this was huge. It was exciting. If you were into that form of racing, as we were, you did, and I certainly did, you just had this naive feeling that this is it. This is going to fix everything. This is all we needed to do. Just put the series back together and it'll be fine. It will take off again. We'll obviously discuss in a moment if that's really happened. I think most of you know the answer. But to go back to February 2008, unification coming that close to the start of the season meant any Champ Car teams who wanted to join the IRL grid for that season were now in a race against time to get kitted up. They were given one used car each and then received another new one to build up themselves. I want to highlight a couple of contrasting views from the IRL side at this point. As while Roger Penske was out there offering cars or parts to any Champ Car teams that came over, IRL loyalist AJ Foyt, who we've heard from we've quoted a few times in this series, he was furious at that idea, saying that if Champ Car teams were going to get help making the transition, he would consider quitting the series. This is AJ Foyt, whose team still races in IndyCar today. In the end, there was a 25-car grid for the season opener at Homestead, where Oriol Servia was the top Champ Car runner, finishing 5 laps down. But then, Graham Rahal, who missed the first race, remarkably won next time out at St. Petersburg for kart mainstay Newman Haas, the team, let's not forget, that brought Nigel Mansell to IndyCar racing. And they'd win again later in the season with Justin Wilson at Detroit. In the end, 10 cars from Champ Car teams took part in the full IRL season that year. And I wanted to pull up this quote from Servia, who said that unification was like having 2 divorced parents who then got back together after 12 years apart. And now the Champ Car guys were the kids moving into the family home and having to adjust to life on the other side of the fence. Ed, a bit of a mishmash of a grid and difficult for those Champ Car teams to adapt in such a short period of time. But what did you make of the first unified season of IndyCar racing since 1995?
Yeah, it didn't quite recapture all the magic, which maybe in the more overexcited moments we thought it might with reunification. I actually remember, I think the first race was Homestead, wasn't it? I remember seeing, just in practice, just footage of Justin Wilson, who was driving for Newman Haas. and just having this understeering monster of a car that they clearly couldn't get right. And I thought,
Was it plain white or carbon black?
in my mind, it was carbon black, but I don't know. It's more the
It was
understeer.
terrifying. I remember the onboards. Absolutely terrifying.
It was just the complete lack of front end that looms in my mind. So, and it's just kind of, oh yeah, this isn't actually just suddenly everything's back to normal and great, and it's not a merger of equals, etc. So, yeah, I mean, the 2008 season was decent. I loved the random Long Beach race with the old panels as well. That had to happen because of the clash with Motegi, just as a last hurrah for Champ Car, even though it was a points background trial.
The famous Danica win was not a full field win. It was against the IRL only field at Motegi. And then, of course, Will Power won that final Champ Car race in the DPO one at Long Beach 24 hours later.
Yeah, so it meant it was all quite weird, and there was all the talk of, yeah, we're unifying the statistics and everything, and
which
so
they
on and
still
so
haven't. I mean, to this day, they utilize the statistics, the history. They use it selectively. It's maddening.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think it probably quite rapidly dawned that this wasn't just suddenly snapping back into kart's peak and everything's great again, because it was very much diminished in terms of the battle scars and the damage done, but it was still good to have a single unified championship. That was a positive, and it was a good season, but it was not night and day different from the 2007 IRL season, despite the influx of well, can you call 10 cars an influx? The bigger grids and the arrival of those teams. So all good, but not. It showed that it wasn't just fixing everything just with a push of a button.
Yeah, I also thought it was telling that you had what kind of car grids in this kind of mid-20s, even though 10 of those were coming from teams that had just moved over from a series that died over the winter. So yeah, the IRL wouldn't have been in great shape without.
That shows you right there that even combined, that all they came up with was 25 cars.
Yeah,
and that's... to this day, they've struggled to have more than 33, 34 Indy 500 entries.
Yeah, which is really, really telling, and just shows where we've got to by this point. We started with a topic that could have been a podcast in itself, which was the 2002 finish to the Indy 500. We'll finish with a podcast that could or maybe should be a topic all by itself, and just try to scratch the surface of the legacy of the split. I mentioned earlier that 2008 was the first time there was one IndyCar series since 1995, but the sport was in a very different place after all that time had passed. In John's book, there are some strong quotes from Chip Ganassi and Dario Franchitti on this. Ganassi says no sport can withstand a split, and I love this quote. He said what happened during those years was a case study of how to watch ice cream melt on your plate. Great line. And Franchitti said he couldn't think of a single winner from all this, apart from NASCAR, and he felt it was a shame that some people were hurt so badly by it that they can't get over it. John, do you agree with Dario that nobody won? Or given that the IRL basically absorbed Champ Car, does that mean that Tony George won?
If there was a winner, it was Tony. It was the IRL. But nobody won. Everybody in IndyCar racing lost. The legacy, there's a couple legacies. The legacy of kart is that it took a racing series that was the Indy 500 and a few crappy oval races, and they turned it into a worldwide successful phenomenon that was the most diverse. Mid-90s kart was great. It was the best of IndyCar, NASCAR, and Formula One all whipped together in a blender. It was spectacular. And the legacy of the IRL is it broke that. It took IndyCar racing when it was at its most successful point, and it squandered it. The legacy of the IRL is that it devalued IndyCar racing. It started with the ovals in the late 90s with the no-name fields and the crappy cars, and they devalued IndyCar racing. And the IRL, frankly, needed to get back together to reestablish its credibility. And by the time they understood that, it was a 5-year process before it finally happened. But yeah, there's a lot of legacy to go around here. And ultimately what we've wound up with is we've got an IndyCar platform that's just a shadow of itself, with no competition between chassis and engine, or, well, on paper there's engine competition, but it's essentially a spec series, and it goes against everything that the history of the Indianapolis 500 of technological excellence and innovation and all that. It's not what it used to be, and it carries on, but they sucked all the value out of it. They sucked all the excitement out of it. And it's just, the more you know about IndyCar racing, the less appealing it has become over the years, unfortunately. You can see that they've just taken it backwards. And it's great that they have the Indy 500 and its history and its tradition to rely upon to continue to sustain the sport. But they had so much more 20, 30 years ago, and they blew it.
Yeah, I mean, I love the Indy 500. It's my favourite individual event on the motorsport calendar, bar none. I've been to it once. I would love to go again. I'm glad that event still prospers in many ways. As you said, we don't have kind of 10 cars fighting out on bump day or anything like that, or what the session they now call bump day, but the crowds are big. There's 33 cars still. The race is still storied, fortunately, but it is sad, as someone who loves IndyCar racing as a whole and has for, as you say, getting on for 30 years now. It is a shame that it feels a lot of the time like the series exists so that there are teams and cars and drivers that are around to enter the Indy 500. And that's kind of the purpose that the rest of the series fulfills now, which, as I said, I didn't see coming. When they finally unified, I had naive, lofty expectations. Ed, we have to accept that the sporting landscape has changed almost beyond recognition since the mid-90s. So there are many championships just in motorsport that were big back then, that didn't necessarily make calamitous mistakes like this, and are nothing or a shadow of what they once were, because things have changed. You know, F1 is perhaps bigger than ever. Most other things aren't. But with that in mind, how much of what happened to IndyCar racing can be put down to the damage done by the split?
Yeah, you can put a lot of it down to that damage, although I think sometimes there's a slightly reductive version of what actually happened, which is that IndyCar splits, and that opens the door for NASCAR to grow. And that's not quite. I mean, from a distance, you can call it that.
That does NASCAR a disservice, doesn't it?
Exactly. Now, NASCAR was growing. I mean, the Daytona 500 was actual live broadcast some years before Indy was, like 6 or 7 years before, if memory serves. So their TV figures were growing. Their TV figures, if you look at 93, 94, 95, for NASCAR, were good. You know, the Indy 500 was obviously still, I think still had the advantage over Daytona, but actually the whole championship, NASCAR was coming on very well. So it wasn't just that IndyCar triggered a decline by having the split, but it stopped it fighting the battle with NASCAR, which was coming. And NASCAR had a number of good things as a proposition, the kind of all-American. It was good for a lot of the commercial partners, you know, the rise of your drivers like Jeff Gordon, who'd come in a few years before the split and maybe in another world could have been an IndyCar driver and an IndyCar star. So it did leave the way open for NASCAR, but NASCAR had already started to rise. And if you compare it to Formula One, there's things that map closely to Formula One. You get the increasing focus on the commercial side, the Bernie Ecclestone revolution that's kind of happening in the early 80s. And you have that with CART sort of splitting from USAC, and then you get some progress through. And then, whereas F1 keeps growing because it's focused, it defeats all opposition, it just grows and grows and grows. The split just prevents all of that happening for IndyCar racing. And you also have to remember that, you know, Formula One as an idea now is so firmly embedded in everybody's ideas. Even non-motorsport fans kind of know what Formula One is. The idea of what IndyCar is, you know, everyone kind of knows when they see what is generically an IndyCar, but actually IndyCar needed to go through the same process of solidifying the idea of what IndyCar is, and the split again stopped that. So that's kind of how I see the whole thing playing out. It basically removed all of its weaponry in terms of fighting off NASCAR, which is the one difference from F1, because NASCAR was a stronger rival than anything F1 had throughout this growth, and was so busy fighting its own little war that it just left the way open for NASCAR to hoover everything up and accelerate its growth. But NASCAR was growing already and a serious rival, because IndyCar racing was still a slightly nebulous idea. And actually going all the way back in history, it's been very different things at different times. And the split stopped IndyCar consolidating and becoming a firm, strong sporting proposition that everybody completely understood. And that's one of the strengths NASCAR had. Everybody knew what NASCAR was, and it was just able to grow and grow and grow.
I think you brought up Jeff Gordon, and I think that Jeff Gordon absolutely symbolizes the Indy split, because here's a guy that came up through USAC, sprint cars and midgets, the old school, the kind of driver that Tony George wanted an Indy 500 driver to be. But Jeff Gordon made a business decision in the early 90s when NASCAR was growing, and Jeff Gordon made the decision to pursue a stock car career instead of an IndyCar career. And some could argue that the IRL came too late for Jeff Gordon. Tony Stewart took the IRL path, and he ended up winning an IRL championship. Having said that, he quickly also reached the decision from a business perspective, stock car racing was a much more appealing path to take. Yeah, you can almost literally symbolize the Indy split through those guys, because they were the old Indy 500, but they didn't match the vision of the Indy 500 from the 80s and early 90s when it became a technology-driven road racing era. So yeah, as you can see, if you want to talk about the Indy split, it is a long, fascinating, complex topic that will continue to be debated as long as any of us are alive. It's debated to this day, the way IndyCar racing is managed, and it's a debate that's never going to go away.
And I guess in terms of could this have been avoided, if I was writing a movie screenplay or a TV series or whatever, the starting point, it's that moment when Tony George kind of makes his move in 91 and gets basically laughed at by the kart teams, and that kind of creates this whole trajectory.
It's the airplane trip back with Tony Bettenhausen, where he says, I'm going to get those guys, I'm going to show them.
And you just wonder if maybe there was some complacency on the part of Kart as well, and perhaps they should have just said, look, we want him inside the tent to create the metaphor rather than on the outside. And maybe
it was a lack of respect in both directions.
Yeah, exactly. And
from the kart team owners about Tony George and the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, but Tony George and the Speedway did not respect and appreciate what kart did in terms of carrying and shaping IndyCar racing during that era.
Exactly, yeah, because it's tempting to kind of put all the blame on Tony George for causing it, but I think throughout this, there's areas where kart let themselves down. They're complacent. They don't sort engine rules. They don't. Even if you look back to the early progress made through the 80s in terms of consolidating, there's still signs that even before the split, they're not really making the most of it in terms of pushing it, getting the TV deals, getting the eyeballs, growing it, etc., etc. So I think it's very that the whole way this plays out, it encourages people to nail their colours to the mast, doesn't it? But actually, the real story is, all of you, why did you let this happen? Because you made yourselves completely incapable of growing IndyCar, as I say, a sporting entity, a sporting proposition that was a little bit nebulous and needed shoring up in the way that Formula One as a thing has become so recognisable. That's the opportunity that was missed, and it's why what we've got now is something so diminished, and just getting back together doesn't make up for all of the lost time.
If they had, by 2010 or 2011, if they had been able to come up with a new and exciting technical formula, if they had manufacturer competition brought back in, if they could have taken advantage of the momentum in 2008 and actually, resume the pattern of growth. But that opportunity is almost 20 years ago now.
Yeah, we'll leave it there then. As you said, John, you could talk about this topic, or we could talk about this topic forever. And it's because people still debate it so much that in 2026, when most people will be listening to this, when we release it in our public feeds, it's still a topic of conversation that is worth all the time we put into this podcast, all the time you put into your brilliant book, which everyone should read if they haven't read it already. A massive thank you to you both for joining us for these 3 episodes. We could have done 10. We could have done 20. If there's a sponsor out there who wants to sponsor us to do 10 or 20 episodes, let us know and we will come back. And just thank you to everyone listening for tuning into something a bit different to the usual Bring Back V10's output. This is a story that, because I lived it as a fan, I'm forever fascinated by it. John's book a few years ago was brilliant. I remember I read that in a matter of days on holiday. I can picture where I was reading it. It's been great to dig back into it and to relive it for these few short episodes with you guys and your perspectives. As I say, we've only really scratched the surface here, so there is a lot more to it. And to go back to what I said at the start of episode 1, I genuinely don't know how there hasn't been a Netflix style like expose series on this. It's got all the ingredients you could possibly want. So we've had a book on it, we've had a podcast series on it. Come on, somebody, come and make an incredible documentary about it. While we wait for that, if you do want to hear us talk about it some more, John's going to come back and join us for an exclusive Q&A in the Race Members Club very soon after these episodes have run in our main feeds in January. So look out for us putting a post out to our members where questions can be submitted. As for Bring Back V10s, we're going to let everyone at the race, including Ed, focus on present day F1 and the huge pre-season we have coming up with the new rules for 2026. Bring Back V10s will be back with season 13 once the F1 season is up and running. So stay tuned to our social media channels and we'll give you a firm date as soon as we can.